Myer, do you have questions
Yes,
or
I do.
discussion?
Yes, I do. And I think my questioning follows on the last exchange we just had. Each of you understandably focused your remarks on the content of the bill and your criticism of elements of the bill. I'd like you to maybe take a step back and say a bit more generally about what's broken in the current refugee determination system. Say a bit more about that. And if you had to pick a single fix that you think should be in a revised refugee bill that isn't in C-11, what is that?
Well, I think one of the things that is broken is the lack of a refugee appeal division, which is in law but has never been enacted. Now, Bill C-11 does introduce the refugee appeal division. However, it puts a limitation on who has access to the appeal division by not allowing people that are coming from safe countries of origin access to the refugee appeal. Amnesty International's position is that everyone should have access to a refugee appeal division. Doesn't matter which country you have come from, that a claim needs to be determined according to the merits of the case. But having access to a refugee appeal is actually something fundamentally that is very broken in our system now. Having an appeal division would again prevent other backlogs at the back end where decisions ultimately have to go into humanitarian and compassionate or into pre-removal risk assessment considerations. An appeal division could hopefully try to resolve those cases so that they wouldn't end up in the back end.
One of the pieces I wanted to speak to in the current manner of doing things is that we've always had issues with the front-end processing, which starts with the initial interview with with CBSA actually at the border. And quite often, we're actually doing a research project on that currently, but, and then of course we'll be comparing it after the legislation comes into effect.
I'm sorry, could you tell me what CBSA means?
Oh, I'm sorry,
sure.
Canada
I'm a
Border
politician, I'm not
Services
quite-
Agency. And Peter, I know you're very familiar. Well, for those of you who don't know, that's the Canada Border Services Agency, who does the initial initial interview when people come, if they're coming across the border or through the airport at the port of entry. One of the things that we've noticed over the years is that quite often that will ultimately determine the outcome of someone's refugee claim, because they don't know what to say. Here they are faced with somebody in a uniform where they've come from a country where they have been persecuted by the police or have been violated by the police, I mean horrible situations, and often say the wrong things, which becomes part of the notes. And those notes then become what goes forward to the IRB, and quite often, as I say, it predetermines sometimes the outcome in a negative way of people's cases. So that would be another area.
It could be we could be here all night talking about what's broken
Yeah.
and different ways to fix it, but staying focused.
What?
Trying here. Decision makers certainly is one issue. Decision makers at the IRB. There are serious problems with the appointments process right now. There have been various attempts or pseudo attempts to fix it, but it remains an awfully political process, and we see that in the specific individuals getting appointed. There are obviously issues as well with respect to remedies, alternative remedies beyond the straight refugee definition. Getting back to what I just said before, but humanitarian and compassionate considerations, other ways of allowing people to regularize status without necessarily being at risk of persecution. So those are a few in there.
Let me follow up on one front to ask, and maybe I'll even ask this. The panelists have been asked to assume that we are simulating what might occur on Parliament Hill. And if this were a real and if members of all parties did appear to take their seats at the committee, which does not always happen apparently, a question along the following lines might come up from one of the parties at the committee. Do we have a problem that there are some countries from which refugee claimants arrive in Canada which have an extraordinarily high rejection rate? So does Canada have a problem in receiving applicants who come from some given countries where you have 95% rejection rates. Is that a problem that Canada's refugee process needs to address?
I'm going to tell you a story of a woman who was a former client of Sojourn House, and I'll try not to be emotional, but it was in the newspaper. This was a woman whose claim was denied. She was from Mexico, and her daughter, after they had been in Canada, they had settled quite successfully. Over the period of time, she was working. She came with her two daughters, one in her early 20s, the other was a young teenager, and her claim was denied. She was deported to Mexico, and her elder daughter was assassinated by the same men who had actually murdered her husband, which was why they escaped to Mexico in the first place. And I think that clearly speaks, certainly to Mexico. The other cases I would speak to from my own experience are the Roma community who have come from Eastern Europe. The stories that I have heard, I have seen men cry in the office telling their story of how during the time when, even when they were in school, and how they were beaten by their colleagues in school, their classmates, they were spit on. And you can't tell me that they're not persecuted in Hungary or the Czech Republic.
There may be ways that one could look at cases of people who are coming from where there's a high rejection rate, but every case has to be an individual hearing and an individual assessment needs to be made. Just because the majority of people coming from a certain country are not refugees does not mean that in that population of people there is not a refugee to be found. So the individual assessment of every claim is absolutely critical in any kind of fair refugee determination process.